The twin who could not be found. On Enantiodromia. A king famed for his goodness banished, one by one, the cruel from his kingdom. He had been crowned at 28. He had been, even before his coronation, a man of unusual gentleness. He had been raised by a mother who had insisted that cruelty was the worst of human qualities. He had absorbed the lesson. He had, in his princehood, refused to attend hunts, refused to witness the punishment of criminals, refused to eat meat at the high table on grounds his servants did not fully understand. He came to the throne with a project. He banished, in the first year, the man who beat his horse. It had been a small case. The man had been a carter in the capital. He had been seen by an alderman striking his draft horse with a whip in a way the alderman had considered excessive. The king had been informed. The king had summoned the carter. The carter had been banished. This had been, in the capital, regarded as the act of a thoughtful young king. The kingdom had approved. He banished, in the second year, the woman who scolded her servants. He banished the child who tormented the village dog. He had been 10. He had been banished with his family to a distant province. He banished the merchant who cheated on his scales. He banished the priest who preached without faith. He banished his own brother who had been merely lazy. The brother's banishment had caused at the court some quiet alarm. The brother had been popular. The brother had been, by any external measure, a kind man. He had been merely indolent, which the king considered a form of cruelty to those who depended on him. The king had been firm. The brother had been escorted to the border with a small purse and a horse and had been told not to return. The kingdom became, by the king's 40th year, white and clean. This was, in some sense, the king's intention. He had not exactly used the word white, but the cleanness had been the goal. He had wanted a kingdom in which no cruelty was permitted to remain. He had achieved it, by his 40th year, to a remarkable degree. The records showed no crimes of cruelty for 2 consecutive years. The taxes were paid on time. The roads were maintained. The kingdom was a model. The king stood in his garden in the White Kingdom alone. He had a wife. He had 3 children. He had a court of ministers. He had 1,000 subjects who came in any given year to seek audience. But he stood in the garden in his 50th year on a morning of cold spring light, and he understood that he was alone. The cruel had been banished. The lazy had been banished. The cheating merchants and the faithless priests and the children who tormented dogs, all had been banished. The kingdom was clean. The kingdom was also, the king could not help noticing, somewhat empty. The people who remained were good people. They were kind to one another. They worked diligently. They paid their taxes. They raised their children in the manner the king's own mother had recommended. They were, in every external respect, a model citizenry. They were also slightly dim. They had a kind of carefulness. They watched one another. They watched the king. They had learned, in the king's 40 years of banishments, that the kingdom was watching for cruelty, and they had become, in response, watchful themselves. They watched their own thoughts. They watched their own moods. They did not, on the whole, in the years after the brother's banishment, take risks. The king did not, in his 50th year, fully see this. He saw it dimly. He saw that something was not as he had imagined the White Kingdom would be. He had imagined it would be joyous. It was, he had to admit, only careful. One morning he could not remember why he should not strike his servant. He had been standing in his bedroom. The servant had brought him his shaving water at the wrong temperature. The water was lukewarm. It should have been hot. The servant had apologized. He had been distracted by his own small troubles. He had been, in his apology, sincere. The king had felt, for the first time, an impulse to strike him. He had not, in his 50 years, struck anyone. He had not understood, before this moment, that the impulse to strike was a thing that, in 50 years of refusing it, could be lost track of. He had assumed that the impulse to strike was, in him, simply absent, that he had been born without it. He understood, in this moment, that he had not been born without it. He had spent 50 years not understanding it. He had spent 50 years banishing it from his presence, first in his own thoughts, by suppressing it, then in his kingdom, by banishing the men who acted on it. He stood in his bedroom with his fist half raised. He could not remember in that moment what he had been protecting. He could not remember what virtue was for. He had banished everything that would have helped him remember. The carter who had beaten the horse had been, in his own way, a man whose impulse to strike had been, in fact, a thing he had been mostly succeeding at restraining. The carter had struck the horse twice. The carter had not struck the horse 100 times. The carter had been, by his own measure, a careful man. The king had not seen this. The king had seen only the 2 strikings and had banished the carter. The carter, in his own province, had been the one who knew how to restrain the impulse, who had, in his own life, lived with it and managed it. The carter had, in some sense, been the kingdom's expert on the impulse. The king had banished the experts. The king stood with his fist raised. The servant looked at him. The servant did not, in the looking, plead. The servant had, in 50 years of the White Kingdom, learned also what the king had learned, that the impulses they had not been allowed to speak about were the impulses they had lost the management of. The servant was prepared to be struck. The king struck him. It was a sharp blow across the face. The servant fell. The servant did not, in the falling, cry out. The king looked at his own hand. It was shaking. He had not, in 50 years, used it for this. He did not, in this moment, know what to do with it. By the evening of that day, the impulse had returned. He struck the cook, who had brought a salty soup. He struck a courtier who had spoken out of turn. He struck the queen, who had attempted gently to ask him what was happening. By the end of that week, he had struck 6 people. By the end of the month, he had banished himself. He left the palace at night, as a previous parable had described another king doing. He took no crown, no horse, no servant. He walked out through the small gate. He left a letter for his eldest son, who was 22, instructing him to take the throne and to consider carefully which of the long list of banished men might be invited home. The eldest son read the letter. He did not, in his own 30-year reign, invite any of them home. He had been raised in the White Kingdom. He did not fully understand the letter. The kingdom continued to be white and careful for another 30 years, until the next king's own son, who had been born after his grandfather's departure, undertook the slow work of inviting the descendants of the banished back. That work took 2 more generations. The king who had departed walked east. He walked for several weeks. He came, one afternoon, to a small house by the side of the road. His brother, who had been banished 15 years before for laziness, was sitting on the small porch. The brother was older. He was, in fact, prosperous in his quiet way. He had married a kind woman. He had 3 children. He had a small farm. He had not been in his banishment particularly unhappy. He had been in his own life the kind of man he had always been, a man whose laziness had been, in the king's view, a moral failing, but in the brother's own life, a kind of patience. The brother looked up. He recognized the king immediately, though he had not seen him in 15 years. "What happened to your kingdom?" said the brother. He did not, in the asking, seem surprised. He had been, somehow, in his own quiet way, expecting his brother for some time. "It became me," said the king. He sat down on the porch. The brother offered him a piece of bread. The bread had been baked that morning by the brother's wife. The king ate it. It was good bread. He stayed with the brother for the rest of his life. He lived another 20 years. He worked in those 20 years as his brother's farmhand. He was not in his work particularly diligent. He had learned, in his last decade in the palace and his banishment from it, that diligence had been the thing that had made him hard. He learned in his brother's house a kind of laziness. He learned to sit in the afternoons. He learned to take naps. He learned to be slow in the mornings. He was, in his old age, kinder than he had been in his White Kingdom. He died at 72 on his brother's porch in the early summer, holding a piece of bread. His own children, by then, were old. They were not, in their own kingdom, kind in the way he had tried to be. They had inherited a different kind of carefulness, less rigorous, more elastic, that allowed the kingdom to begin, slowly, to thaw. The kingdom, in some province, is still thawing. The banished, in some province, are still being invited back. The thing you have banished, is the thing you become, the kingdom that exiles all its cruelty, becomes a cruel king alone in a clean garden. The work is to keep the cruel and the lazy and the cheat in the kingdom, because they were the ones who knew where you should not go. The carter who struck the horse had been managing the impulse you banished. The manager, you will in time strike the horse. Yourself, the brother on the porch, has been waiting. The bread is good, the laziness in your old age is what makes you, at last, kind.